They thought the orphan had nothing until he turned a Quonset hut into a 3-story home no one expected. What he found inside that rusted metal shell wasn't just a strange inheritance. It was a blueprint for a life he never thought he could have. If you've ever felt counted out or left behind, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and stick around, because we're about to talk about what it really means to build a home. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist. Not as a person, of course. I still breathed the same recycled air in the county services building, still wore the same state-issued jeans that were always an inch too short. But as a ward of the state, as a case file number, as a problem to be managed, that person was gone. His name was Leo, and he had officially expired. In his place stood, well, me. Also Leo, but a different kind. The kind without a safety net, without a morning check-in, without a destination. Freedom, they called it. It felt a lot like falling. My caseworker, a tired woman named Janice, who'd seen 1,000 kids like me come and go, handed me a manila envelope. Inside was my birth certificate, my social security card, and a final check for $257. "That's it, Leo," she said, not unkindly. Her eyes had the permanent glaze of someone running on institutional coffee and low-grade despair. "You're officially aged out. Good luck." Good luck. The 2 words hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, meaningless and everywhere at once. I had spent the last 10 years of my life in a system designed to keep me alive, but not to teach me how to live. 2 years at St. Jude's Home for Boys, then 8 years bouncing between 3 different foster families before landing back in a group home for the final stretch. It was a life of provisional spaces, of temporary beds and borrowed toothbrushes. A life of learning not to get too attached to anything or anyone. Janice cleared her throat, pulling me from the spiral. "There is one more thing," she said, sliding a second, much thinner envelope across the scratched laminate desk. This one was crisp, white, and bore the embossed logo of a law firm. "This came for you about a week ago, addressed to you, care of the county. We held it until your birthday, per the instructions." I picked it up. It felt impossibly light, as if it held nothing but air. My name was typed on the front. Leo Vance. The name I shared with a ghost. My grandfather. He died when I was 7, a year before my mom followed him. I barely remembered him. A vague impression of calloused hands, the smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco, a low voice that rumbled like distant thunder. After Mom's death, there was no one, just the system. "A lawyer?" I asked, my own voice sounding foreign. "For what?" Janice shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both ignorance and a profound lack of curiosity. "No idea. It's from a firm out in Stillwater County, probably some formality regarding your grandfather's estate." I almost laughed. Estate. The word conjured images of sprawling mansions and trust funds. My grandfather, from what little I remembered and the even less I was told, was a retired carpenter who lived in a tiny cabin somewhere out in the sticks. His estate probably consisted of a box of worn-out tools and a collection of plaid shirts. Still, it was something, a thread, however thin, to a past I barely knew. I tucked the thin envelope into the pocket of my jacket, the thick manila one into my backpack. "Okay," I said, standing up. The finality of the moment was a physical weight. This was the door, the one I'd been walking toward my entire life. I had always imagined what it would be like, stepping through it. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt hollow. Janice gave me a small, tight smile. There's a bus that leaves from the downtown depot at 2. It heads east. It's a start. A start. I walked out of the county services building and into the cold, gray afternoon. The city noise, a thing I'd grown up inside, suddenly felt alien and aggressive. Car horns blared. People rushed past me, their faces set in masks of grim purpose. I was an island in the middle of a river, and the current was pulling me apart. I found a bench at a bus stop and sat, the hard plastic cold through my jeans. I pulled out the lawyer's letter. My fingers trembled slightly as I tore it open. The paper inside was thick, expensive. The letter was short. It was from a Mr. Alistair Abe, attorney at law, informing me that as the sole heir of the late Arthur Vance, I was to inherit the entirety of his remaining property upon my 18th birthday. It requested my presence at his office in the town of Northwood, Stillwater County, to finalize the transfer of deed. It ended with a phone number and a line that felt like it was from another century. I look forward to making your acquaintance. Property. A deed. These were words for adults, for people with lives and foundations and futures. They felt absurd when applied to me. I looked at the $257 in my other envelope. That felt real. That was 3 weeks in a cheap motel, if I was lucky. A month of ramen noodles and bus station coffee. That was the scale of my world. This letter, with its talk of deeds and inheritance, felt like a prank, or a mistake. But it was also the only thing I had. The bus to Stillwater County left at 2. It was a start. I looked at my worn-out sneakers, the faded patch on the knee of my jeans, the backpack that held everything I owned in the world. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment my life finally began. Or maybe it was just another dead end. There was only one way to find out. The meeting with Mr. Abe was as strange and formal as his letter. His office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. The town of Northwood wasn't much of a town at all. It was a main street with a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and Mr. Abe's law practice. The rest was just quiet houses and tall pine trees that crowded the edges of the road, patiently waiting to reclaim the asphalt. Mr. Abe was a small, neat man in his late 60s, with a fringe of white hair around a polished scalp and eyes that were magnified by thick, round glasses. He looked less like a lawyer and more like an owl who had decided to take up accounting. He shook my hand with a dry, firm grip. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a quiet, precise hum. "Please, have a seat. I'm glad you made it." I sat in a stiff leather chair that sighed under my weight. The office was lined with books, not the fake decorative kind, but real, leather-bound volumes that looked like they contained the secrets of the universe. A slow-moving ceiling fan stirred the dusty air. It was the quietest room I had ever been in. "Janice, my caseworker, she said you had something for me," I started, feeling the need to fill the silence. "About my grandfather." "Indeed," Mr. Abe said. He opened a folder on his large oak desk. "Arthur was a client of mine for many years, a good man, quiet, kept to himself." He paused, looking at me over his glasses. "You have his eyes." I didn't know what to say to that. I had my own eyes, as far as I was concerned. They'd seen things I was sure my grandfather never had. Mr. Abe seemed to understand my discomfort and turned his attention back to the folder. "Your grandfather's will was very straightforward. He had little in the way of liquid assets, but he owned a piece of land outright. a 5-acre parcel about 10 miles east of town. Upon his death, it was to be held in trust for you until your 18th birthday. That day, I'm told, was yesterday. He slid a thick document across the desk, a deed. My name was typed at the top, Leo Vance. It looked even more imposing on this official paper. This makes you the legal owner of Lot 7, Stillwater County, he explained. It's yours, free and clear. The property taxes have been paid up through the end of the year from the trust. I stared at the paper. 5 acres. It was an abstraction. I couldn't picture it. What's on it? I asked. A structure, he said carefully. A Quonset hut. I must have looked confused because he elaborated. A prefabricated building of corrugated steel, semicircular, like half a tin can. The military used them a lot after the war. He steepled his fingers. It is, by all accounts, in a state of some disrepair. Disrepair. That was a lawyer's word for falling apart. So, I owned a rusty tin can on 5 acres of weeds. Great. It was more than I'd had yesterday, but it was also somehow less than I had hoped for. Hope is a dangerous thing for a kid like me. I'd learned early to crush it before it got too big. I see, I said, my voice flat. Mr. Abe watched me, his expression unreadable. There is another matter, he said, pulling a second letter from the folder. This one had a different logo, one I didn't recognize. I've been contacted by a firm representing Sterling Development. They are aware that the property has transferred to you. They have made an offer. He slid the letter over. I picked it up. It was an offer to purchase the 5-acre parcel. The number printed in the middle of the page made my breath catch. $75,000. I read it again, and a third time. The number didn't change. It was more money than I had ever imagined holding. It was a new life. It was a car, an apartment, a chance to go to community college. It was a clean break. It was everything. 75,000? I whispered. The words felt like stones in my mouth. Why? They're planning a bypass, Mr. Abe said calmly. A new highway connector that will cut through that part of the county. Your grandfather's property is right in the middle of their projected route. They've been buying up all the surrounding parcels for the last year. Yours is one of the last they need. Of course. It wasn't about the land. It was about the location. My inheritance wasn't a home. It was a roadblock. And Sterling Development wanted to pay me to bulldoze it. They say the offer is valid for 30 days, Mr. Abe continued. They are prepared to close quickly. The funds could be in your account within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. My mind raced. No more motels. No more wondering where my next meal would come from. I could leave this place, leave the memory of the system behind, and start over somewhere new, somewhere anonymous. It was the smart play, the only play. You should take it, I said, looking up at him. Right? I should take the money. I was asking for his permission, I realized. For this stranger, this owl-like man who knew my grandfather, to tell me it was okay to sell the last piece of him for cash. Mr. Abe adjusted his glasses. He didn't answer immediately. He just watched me. The decision is yours, Leo, he said, his voice even. However, your grandfather's instructions to me were very specific. I was to give you the deed, inform you of any standing offers, and provide you with this. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, heavy object, a key. It was old, made of tarnished brass, with a simple, circular head. He placed it on the desk between the deed and the offer letter. He wanted you to see the property for yourself before you made any decisions. A key to a derelict Quonset hut. It seemed ridiculous, standing next to a check for $75,000. A sentimental gesture, a fool's errand. Any sane person would have laughed, signed the papers, and walked away a rich man. I wasn't sure if I was a sane person. I had spent a decade being told what to do, where to go, who to be. The idea of making a decision this big on my own was terrifying. But the key, it felt heavy in my palm. It felt real. It was a connection, a question. The money was an ending. The key was a beginning. "How do I get there?" I asked. Mr. Abe gave the slightest hint of a smile. It was the first real expression I'd seen on his face. "The afternoon bus runs east. Get off at the old logging road about 9 miles out. From there, it's a short walk." He stood, signaling the end of our meeting. "One more thing, Leo. Your grandfather, he believed that a man's worth isn't in what he's given, but in what he builds." He held my gaze. "Go see what he left you." I walked out of his office with a deed I didn't understand, a key I didn't know the lock for, and a choice that felt impossibly heavy. The $75,000 offer felt like a siren song, luring me toward a safe, easy shore. But my grandfather's key was a compass point, pulling me toward an unknown wilderness. I had enough money for a motel room in town. I could think it over, be sensible. But Janice's words came back to me. A start. I walked past the motel, past the diner, and stood at the bus stop on the edge of town, the key growing warm in my pocket. The bus groaned to a halt at the side of the 2-lane highway, the hydraulic hiss of its doors opening, sounding unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. "Old logging road," the driver grunted, not bothering to look back at me. "This is you." I stepped off the bus and into a world that was overwhelmingly green and silent. The air was different here. It was thick with the smell of pine needles, damp earth, and something wild I couldn't name. The bus pulled away, its diesel engine fading until the only sounds were the whisper of wind in the treetops and the frantic beating of my own heart. I was completely, utterly alone. The logging road was less a road and more a suggestion. 2 dirt tracks, overgrown with weeds and moss, disappearing into a tunnel of trees. According to Mr. Abe's hand-drawn map, my property was about a half-mile in. My property. The words still felt alien. I adjusted the backpack on my shoulders. It felt flimsy, a pathetic collection of my past life in this vast, ancient landscape. I started walking. The silence was unnerving at first. In the city, in the group home, there was always noise. A TV muttering in another room, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant wail of a siren. Silence was a vacuum. Here, the silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the rustle of something unseen in the undergrowth, the buzz of an insect, the creak of a branch high above. My city senses were useless. Every snap of a twig sounded like a threat. I clutched the key in my pocket, its sharp edges digging into my palm. It was a talisman against the encroaching wild. After about 15 minutes of walking, the trees on the left side of the road thinned, opening into a small clearing. And there it was, the Quonset hut. It was worse than I had imagined, much worse. The corrugated steel was streaked with long, weeping trails of rust. The arched roof sagged in the middle, as if it had shrugged in defeat years ago. Weeds and thorny bushes grew in a thick, defensive tangle around its base. climbing halfway up the walls. A large, faded number 7 was painted on the front, barely visible beneath the grime. This was my inheritance, a collapsing metal shed being slowly consumed by the forest. The $75,000 offer didn't just seem like the smart play anymore. It seemed like a miracle. Who would pay that much for this heap of junk? I pushed my way through the thorny bushes, their branches snagging at my jeans. The front of the hut featured a large sliding door, the kind you'd see on a barn. It was jammed shut, its runners clogged with rust and dirt. To the side was a smaller, man-sized door, and on it, a heavy-duty padlock. It was old and rusted, but it looked solid. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It looked impossibly small and delicate compared to the brutal-looking lock. For a moment, I was sure it wouldn't work. This was all a joke, a wild goose chase. The key would be for something else, something long gone. My hand was shaking as I inserted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly. I turned it. There was a loud, grating click that echoed in the quiet clearing. The lock sprang open. I stood there for a second, stunned. It worked. He had left a key, and after all these years it still worked. I pulled the heavy lock free and slid the bolt. The door was swollen in its frame, and I had to put my shoulder into it, grunting with effort. It gave way with a groan of protest, opening into a square of profound darkness. The air that rolled out was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time. It was the scent of dust, of decay, of mice, and faintly, underneath it all, the ghost of sawdust and oil. I hesitated on the threshold. My instincts, honed by years of navigating unpredictable environments, screamed at me to turn back. This was not a safe place. But this was also the place my grandfather wanted me to see. I took a deep breath of the fresh pine air, held it, and stepped inside. The darkness was almost total. The only light came from the doorway behind me and a few grimy, cobweb-covered windows set high up on the walls. Dust motes danced like tiny galaxies in the beams of light. As my eyes adjusted, the interior began to take shape. It was bigger than it looked from the outside. The arched ceiling soared high above me, creating a space that felt like a cathedral of rust. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven. The space was cluttered, but not messy. It was organized chaos. Along one wall were workbenches, covered in a thick blanket of dust. Tools hung from a pegboard, each one outlined in grime, hanging like a patient ghost. There were stacks of lumber, neatly piled and covered in tarps. Metal shelving units stood against the far wall, loaded with boxes, cans, and mysterious, sheet-draped shapes. It wasn't an abandoned shed. It was a workshop. A workshop that had been put to bed, waiting for someone to come and wake it up. I walked deeper into the space, my footsteps echoing unnervingly. I ran my hand along a workbench, leaving a clean streak in the dust. Underneath, the wood was solid oak, worn smooth by years of work. I saw a drill press, a table saw, a massive vise attached to the bench. These were serious tools. This was the domain of a master craftsman, my grandfather. In the center of the vast floor, there was a single object, draped in a heavy canvas tarp. It was large, about the size of a small car. Curiosity pulled me toward it. The tarp was heavy, stiff with age. I grabbed a corner and pulled. It came away with a cloud of dust that made me cough, the canvas rasping against the object beneath. What I saw made no sense. It was a staircase, a beautifully crafted, freestanding spiral staircase made of dark, polished wood and wrought iron. It rose about 10 feet into the air, ending at a small landing that led to nothing. It was just hanging there, in the middle of the empty space, a staircase to nowhere. I stared at it, completely baffled. Why would anyone build this? Why would it be the centerpiece of this workshop? It was beautiful, a piece of art, but it was utterly nonsensical. I walked around it, touching the smooth, cool metal of the railing. The craftsmanship was incredible. Every joint was perfect, every curve elegant. This wasn't the work of a simple carpenter. This was the work of an artist, an engineer. My eyes followed the staircase up to its pointless destination. And that's when I saw something else. High above the landing, almost lost in the shadows of the arched ceiling, was a faint, rectangular outline. A section of the corrugated steel ceiling looked different. It was a patch, a door, a trapdoor in the roof of a Quonset hut. The staircase wasn't a staircase to nowhere. It was a staircase to somewhere else. But that wasn't the only secret this place held. My gaze dropped from the ceiling back to the cluttered shelves and workbenches. Something felt deliberate about the layout. It wasn't random. I started to explore more methodically, running my hands over the tarp-covered shapes. Most were just more stacks of building materials, drywall, insulation, pipes. But against the back wall, tucked behind a stack of what looked like steel beams, was a heavy, military green footlocker. It was old, dented, and secured with a thick combination lock. Unlike the front door, there was no key for this. It was sealed tight. I knelt in front of it, the cold of the concrete seeping through my jeans. I pulled on the lock, but it was solid. This was meant to stay closed. My heart started to pound again, a slow, heavy rhythm. The staircase, the trapdoor, the locked chest. This wasn't just a workshop, it was a puzzle, and my grandfather had left it for me to solve. I looked around the dusty space, at the silent tools and sleeping materials. The offer from Sterling Development felt 1,000,000 miles away. $75,000 was a number on a piece of paper. This was real. It was a mystery, written in steel and wood and dust. A story my grandfather had left for me to read. And I realized, with a sudden, shocking clarity, that I couldn't walk away. I couldn't sell it. Not yet. Not until I knew what was in that box. The combination lock on the footlocker was a declaration of defiance. It was a simple 3-digit mechanism, but it might as well have been a bank vault. I tried the obvious things first. My birthday, his birthday, or what I guessed it was from the dates on the legal papers. Nothing. I tried 123, 777 for lot 7. The lock held firm, a silent metal guardian of my grandfather's secrets. Frustration began to curdle into a familiar, bitter resignation. This was just like the system. A series of locked doors, with me on the wrong side. For a moment, I was ready to give up. I could walk back to the highway, catch the next bus, call Mr. Abe and tell him to draw up the papers. I could take the money and run. But then I looked at the spiral staircase. It stood there in the gloom, so full of purpose and patience. It was a promise of something more. It was a challenge. My grandfather hadn't led me here to a dead end. The lock wasn't a barrier. It was a test. A test of what? Patience? Intelligence? I looked around the workshop, my eyes scanning the dusty surfaces for a clue. A number scrawled on a wall, a date on an old calendar. The place was filled with objects, but they were all mute. I ran my hand over the workbench again, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood. And then I felt it. Underneath the lip of the bench, my fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood. It was a series of small, shallow divots. I ducked my head, squinting in the dim light. 3 numbers had been carved into the underside of the bench, so discreetly I never would have seen them if I hadn't been touching them. 841. My breath hitched. It was so simple, so clever. A clue hidden in plain sight, revealed only by touch, by a connection with his workspace. I scrambled back to the footlocker, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wiped my dusty, trembling fingers on my jeans and carefully turned the dials. 8, 4, 1. I pulled the shackle. With a soft, satisfying snick, the lock opened. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I was in. I lifted the heavy lid of the footlocker. The air that escaped was dry and smelled of old paper and cedar. The top layer was a neatly folded wool blanket, a small bag of cedar chips resting on top to ward off moths. He was a practical man, even in his secrets. I lifted the blanket. Underneath, my world tilted on its axis. The chest was filled with bundles of cash. Not hundreds of thousands, but it was more money than I had ever seen in one place. Stacks of 20s and 50s, bound with simple rubber bands. I pulled out one bundle. It felt solid, heavy, real. I fanned the bills. There must have been thousands of dollars here. Maybe 10, 15,000? It was a fortune. It was a lifeline. But that wasn't all. Beneath the cash were documents, not legal papers, but architectural blueprints, rolled tightly and tied with string. And under those, a stack of letters bound in twine. The envelopes were thick, creamy paper, and on the front of the top one, in a strong, slightly slanted script, was my name. Leo. I sat back on my heels, the cold of the concrete floor a distant sensation. The cash was a shock, but the letters were a miracle. It was a voice from the grave, a message in a bottle that had waited more than a decade to wash ashore. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely untie the twine. I pulled the first letter from its envelope. The paper was crisp, the ink a dark, faded blue. The date at the top was from a month after he died. Mr. Abe must have mailed them to himself, a set of instructions for the future. The letter began. "My dear Leo," I read the words, and I could almost hear them in that low, rumbling voice from my fragmented memories. "If you are reading this, then you have found your way here. You are 18, a man grown, and you have passed my first small test. I am sorry I could not be there to see you open this. I am sorry for so much." My eyes burned. I had to stop and wipe them with the back of my dusty hand. I had spent 10 years building a wall around that part of my heart, the part that mourned a family I barely knew. And in 2 sentences, my grandfather's words had breached it. I took a shaky breath and continued reading. "I imagine you are standing in this dusty old hut, wondering what kind of inheritance this is. You are probably holding an offer from a developer for a respectable sum of money. I have foreseen this. Mr. Abe, a good man, has instructions to inform you of any such offers. I want you to know that if you take that money, I will not blame you. It is a clean start. It is a path to a life easier than the one I had, and perhaps easier than the one you have had so far. There is no shame in choosing it." The generosity of that sentiment, the permission to walk away, almost broke me. He wasn't trying to trap me. He was giving me a real choice. "But if you are still reading," the letter went on, "it means some part of you is as stubborn and curious as I was. It means you saw the staircase, and you are wondering what it all means. So, I will tell you, this land, this hut, this is not your inheritance, Leo. It is the beginning of it. It is a promise." I looked up from the letter, my eyes tracing the soaring arc of the steel ceiling. A promise. When I retired, he wrote, I had a little money saved and a lot of time. I bought this land because it was cheap and unwanted, and I had an idea born of my trade. A Quonset hut is a shell. It is strong, weatherproof, and cheap. People see it as a shed, a garage, but I saw something else. I saw a frame. I saw a foundation. My eyes darted to the blueprints. I fumbled with the string, unrolling the first one on the dusty floor. The drawing was detailed, precise. It showed the Quonset hut, but with 2 more floors built inside it. It showed rooms, windows, a living space, a kitchen, bedrooms. It showed a home. A complete 3-story home, ingeniously designed to fit within the massive curve of the steel shell. The spiral staircase in the center was the spine, connecting all 3 levels. The trapdoor in the ceiling wasn't a trapdoor. It was for a skylight. A massive skylight at the apex of the roof that would flood the entire interior with natural light. It wasn't a rusty shed. It was a cocoon. And my grandfather had left me the instructions on how to force the butterfly out. I went back to the letter, my mind reeling. All the materials you need are here, he wrote. The steel for the interior framing is stacked against the wall. The lumber is seasoned and ready. The plumbing, the wiring, the insulation. It is all here, paid for. I bought it piece by piece, over years. It was my secret project, my ark. I worked on it until I got sick. I didn't have time to finish, but you can. I looked around the workshop with new eyes. The sheet-draped objects were not junk. They were a dismantled house, a kit of parts, waiting for an assembler. The cash in the box wasn't just a stash of money. It was a salary. It was money for food, for taxes, for anything I would need while I worked. It was freedom from the need to get a job, so I could do this job. This is a hard path, Leo, the letter concluded. It will take work. It will take all the strength and patience you have. People will tell you you are a fool. They will tell you to take the money and run. But I am leaving you more than a house. I am leaving you a trade. The tools are on the wall. The plans are in this box. Everything I know is in this place. If you build this house, you will have more than a roof over your head. You will have a skill. You will have a purpose. You will have a home that you earned, that you created with your own 2 hands. You will have a foundation, not of concrete, but of your own sweat and spirit. He signed it simply, your grandfather, Arthur. I sat there on the cold floor, in the dusty, silent cathedral my grandfather had built, and I wept. I cried for the 10 years of feeling alone, of feeling worthless, of being a number in a file. I cried for the boy who thought he had no one, and for the man who had spent his last years preparing a legacy of love and purpose for a grandson he barely knew. The choice wasn't a choice at all anymore. The $75,000 felt like an insult. It was a bribe to get me to abandon the most precious gift I had ever been given. This wasn't an inheritance of property. It was an inheritance of faith. My grandfather had looked at a rusty metal shell and seen a home. And now, he was asking me to do the same. He was asking me to look at myself, a discarded, forgotten kid from the system, and see a builder. The weight of it all settled on me, a physical pressure in the dim, quiet hut. Grief, hope, fear, gratitude. They were a tangled knot in my chest. For 10 years, my world had been small, contained, and dictated by others. My choices had been trivial: what to eat in the cafeteria, which corner to sit in during free time. Now, I was faced with a choice that would define the entire course of my life. Sell or build. Easy money or hard-earned purpose. An escape or a foundation. My grandfather's letter was an act of profound trust. He didn't command me. He laid out the options with a calm, respectful clarity and trusted me to choose. He trusted a boy he hadn't seen in a decade to understand the value of work over wealth. He trusted me to be his grandson. Could I be that person? I looked at my hands. They were soft, unused to labor. I had never built anything more complicated than a model airplane, and even that had ended with glue smeared everywhere and a crooked wing. I was a product of institutions, of concrete hallways and fluorescent lights. What did I know of steel beams and load-bearing walls? The blueprints were a foreign language of lines and numbers. The tools on the wall were intimidating shapes of metal and plastic. The sheer scale of the project was dizzying. Building a 3-story house? Alone? It was insane. My mind, a well-trained machine for finding the path of least resistance, screamed at me to take the money. $75,000. I could be anyone, anywhere. I could buy a used car, drive west and never look back. I could get a small apartment, find a simple job, and live a quiet, anonymous life. It was a safe harbor in a stormy world. No one would blame me. My grandfather himself had said so. It was the sensible path. And yet, I thought of the group home, of the dead-eyed kids and the exhausted staff, of the feeling of being temporary, a placeholder in someone else's space. I thought of the years of carrying everything I owned in a backpack, of sleeping in beds that would never be mine. An apartment bought with a developer's money would be the same, wouldn't it? Just a nicer, more private box. It wouldn't be a home. It would be a waiting room. This place, this project, this was the opposite of all that. This was about putting down roots so deep they cracked the concrete floor. It was about transforming a place of rust and neglect into a place of light and life. It was about building something permanent in a world that had always felt transient. I felt a sob rise in my throat, hot and sharp. It was a sob of fear. I was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of dishonoring his memory. What if I tried and I couldn't do it? What if I messed it up, wasted the materials, and ended up with nothing but a half-finished wreck and a broken dream? Then I would lose both the house and the money. I'd be worse off than I was now. The weight of that possibility was crushing. I curled up on the cold floor, my head on my knees, and let the fear wash over me. I was just a kid. I was just Leo, the boy who aged out. Who was I to think I could do something so monumental? I stayed like that for a long time, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing in the dusty silence. The last light from the doorway began to fade, and the deep shadows in the corners of the hut started to merge. The place was growing cold. I needed to make a decision. I needed to get up. I thought about Mr. Abe. A man's worth isn't in what he's given, but in what he builds. I thought about the key and the carved numbers under the bench. My grandfather had believed I could do this. He had structured this whole thing like a game, a series of small victories to build my confidence. Find the hut, open the door. Find the clue, open the chest. Each step was designed to lead me to the next. He was teaching me, even in death. I slowly, stiffly got to my feet. My body ached from the cold and the tension. I walked over to the footlocker and looked at the stack of letters. There were at least a dozen of them. This was just the first chapter. He had left me a whole book. I picked up the second letter. I didn't open it. I just held it. This was the crossroads. If I walked away now, I'd never know what the other letters said. I'd never know the rest of the story. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would wonder about it for the rest of my life. That wondering would be its own kind of prison. You know, a lot of people watching this might be at a crossroads of their own. Maybe it's not a rusty Quonset hut and a pile of cash, but it's a choice between the easy road and the hard one, the safe bet and the terrifying dream. If this is hitting you right now, I want you to know you're not alone. This community we're building here, it's for people who get it, who know that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that demand the most from us. If you believe in that, if you've ever had to make a choice like this, let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Because this story, my story, wasn't over. It was just getting started. I took out my phone. The battery was at 20%, but I had a signal. Just one bar, but it was enough. I found the number for Mr. Abe's office on the letterhead. It was late, well past business hours, but I called it anyway. I expected an answering machine. Instead, he picked up on the second ring. "Abe," he said, his voice as crisp as it was in his office. "Mr. Abe, it's Leo Vance." There was a pause. I could hear the faint sound of a ticking clock in the background. "Leo," he said. His voice was different, softer. "You found it." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," I said, my voice thick. "I found it." "And?" he asked gently. I looked at the blueprints spread on the floor, at the spiral staircase reaching for the sky, at the stack of letters waiting to be read. I took a deep breath. "Tell Sterling Development the answer is no," I said. The words felt like solid things, like the first stones being laid for a new foundation. "The property is not for sale." There was another long pause on the line. I thought maybe he was going to argue, to tell me I was being a fool. Instead, when he spoke, his voice was filled with something that sounded like quiet pride. "I will inform them in the morning," he said. "Your grandfather would be pleased. Now, there's a small generator in the back corner, behind the insulation. There should be fuel for it. And check the blue bin by the workbench. Arthur said he left a lantern and some food. You'll need light and a hot meal. The work begins tomorrow." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. He knew. He knew about the generator, the food. He was in on it. He wasn't just the lawyer. He was the groundskeeper of my grandfather's dream. "The work begins tomorrow." The words echoed in the vast, dark space. I found the generator, and after a few pulls, it sputtered to life with a roar, its engine a sudden, violent intrusion into the silence. I found the work light and a string of bulbs and plugged them in. One by one, the lights flickered on, illuminating the workshop in a harsh, yellow glare. The dust, the tools, the stacks of materials, they were all thrown into sharp relief. It was real, all of it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't in a temporary space. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a case file. I was home. And the work was just beginning. The next morning, I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of profound quiet, broken only by the chirping of birds. I had slept on the wool blanket from the footlocker, my backpack for a pillow, the concrete floor a hard, unforgiving mattress. Every muscle in my body ached, but as I sat up and looked around the workshop, now filled with the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the grimy windows, the aches didn't matter. A sense of purpose, sharp and clear, cut through the fog of sleep. This was day one. I made coffee on a small camp stove I found in the blue bin, just as Mr. Abe had said. The bin was a treasure trove of starter supplies: canned stew, coffee, a pot, a lantern, beef jerky. My grandfather had thought of everything. While the coffee brewed, I opened the second letter. "Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, you have made your choice. I am proud of you, more than you can know. Today, your education begins. The first rule of any builder is this: know your foundation. Before you build up, you must be certain of what you are building on." The letter instructed me to inspect the concrete slab. He told me to look for hairline cracks, signs of water damage, or any unevenness. He explained how to use a chalk line and a level to check the floor. He told me about a hidden compartment in the floor, near the southeast corner, where I would find sealant, patching compound, and a set of heavy-duty floor grinders. "A house is only as strong as its base," he wrote. "Don't be in a hurry to see walls go up. The most important work is often the work no one will ever see. Do this right, and this house will outlive you. Do it wrong, and it will never be truly safe." That first week was grueling, humbling, and utterly transformative. I learned the geography of the concrete slab like the back of my hand. I found the hidden compartment, a section of the floor that lifted up to reveal a small cellar, perfectly organized with the supplies he'd described. I spent days on my hands and knees, cleaning, patching, and grinding. The floor grinder was a beast of a machine. It fought me, rattling my bones, filling the air with a fine white dust that coated everything. At the end of each day, I was exhausted, filthy, and my hands were raw. But the floor was becoming something else. It was becoming perfect, smooth, level, and solid. I was not just repairing a floor, I was learning a lesson: patience, precision, the importance of the unseen. Each night, I would read a new letter. Each letter was a new lesson. One was about the steel. He explained the color-coded markings on the beams, how they corresponded to the blueprints. He taught me the basics of metal framing, how to bolt the pieces together, the importance of torque settings. Another letter was about the tools. He introduced me to them like old friends. "The table saw is the heart of the workshop, but she is unforgiving. Respect her. Measure twice, cut once, and always know where your fingers are." He explained the drill press, the router, the welding torch I found in another cabinet. His voice, through the letters, was my instructor, my guide, my mentor. Slowly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a growing confidence. I was learning. I was doing. I made mistakes. I cut a piece of steel an inch too short and cursed my own stupidity, the sound echoing in the empty hut. I spent an entire day trying to figure out a complex joint on the blueprint, my brain aching with the effort. But I didn't give up. I'd read the relevant letter again, study the diagram, and try again. And when the joint finally fit perfectly, the feeling of triumph was a physical rush, more potent than any drug. The first major turning point came about a month in. According to the plans, it was time to erect the first two main support columns for the second floor. They were massive steel I-beams, 15 feet long. There was no way I could lift them myself. The plans showed a block and tackle system, and all the parts were in a crate. But I'd never used one before. The physics of it seemed like magic. I spent 2 days assembling it, hoisting it to the ceiling rafters, my arms burning, my nerves frayed. I looped the chains around the first beam and began to pull. The chain tightened, the beam groaned, and then, slowly, miraculously, the massive piece of steel began to lift off the floor. It rose into the air, swaying gently, a multi-ton pendulum of my potential failure. I guided it into place, my hands shaking, sweat stinging my eyes. With the beam hovering inches from its destination, I bolted it to the floor plate and the ceiling anchor. Then the second one. By the end of the day, 2 massive steel columns stood in the middle of the workshop, silent sentinels of progress. They were the first vertical structures, the first real sign that a house was growing here. I stood back, my whole body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, and I laughed. A real, loud, joyful laugh. The sound was foreign in that space, but it felt right. The outside world had ceased to exist. My life was the hut, the plans, the letters, and the work. Occasionally, I'd have to walk into town for groceries. The first few times, people in Northwood stared. I was a strange, dusty figure, always buying practical, cheap food. The cashier at the hardware store, a friendly guy named Sal, started asking questions. "Building something out at the old Vance place?" he asked one day, ringing up a box of screws. "Something like that," I said, not wanting to explain the ridiculous truth. But Sal was persistent. "Your granddad, Arthur, he used to come in here all the time, bought up half the store over the years. Never said what he was building, just smiled and said it was a project for his grandson." He winked. "Guess that's you." The community, which I had expected to be hostile or indifferent, started to reveal itself in small ways. One afternoon, an old pickup truck rumbled down the logging road. An elderly man with a face like a road map got out. "Name's Hank," he said, his voice gravelly. "Used to work with your granddad. Heard you were trying to finish his folly." He looked past me into the hut and saw the 2 steel columns. His eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He was serious. He spent the next hour walking me through the blueprints for the second-floor joists, pointing out things my grandfather's letters hadn't mentioned, small tricks of the trade. He didn't offer to help. That wasn't the way. But he offered knowledge. He was testing me, just as my grandfather had. The work continued, day by day, week by week. I laid the steel joists for the second floor, creating a grid of metal that spanned the space above my head. Then came the subfloor, heavy sheets of plywood that I had to haul up the spiral staircase one by one. The day I secured the last sheet, I stood on the second floor for the first time. I was 10 feet off the ground, standing on a solid surface that I had built. I could see the workshop below me, the tools, the benches, and through the high, grimy windows, I could see the tops of the pine trees. It was a new perspective. I wasn't on the ground anymore. I was rising. The house was rising, and so was I. The construction of the second floor marked a shift, not just in the physical structure, but in me. The initial terror had been replaced by a steady, quiet competence. I moved with a new economy of motion, my hands now calloused and sure. I knew the feel of the tools, the weight of the materials. The blueprints were no longer a mystery. They were a conversation. The second floor was where the living spaces would be. A kitchen, a living room. This meant plumbing and wiring. The letters for this phase were the most complex yet. My grandfather's handwriting became a dense script of electrical diagrams and plumbing schematics. He wrote about breaker boxes, P-traps, and GFCI outlets. It was a whole new language. There were moments of intense frustration. I spent a week trying to sweat a particularly difficult copper pipe joint, burning my fingers and wasting solder. I was ready to tear it all out. That night, I read the corresponding letter again. "Leo," it said, "the water will find any weakness. Be more patient than the water. The pipe only knows the heat and the solder. You know the purpose. Your will must be stronger than its resistance." I went back the next morning, cleaned the joint meticulously, applied the flux with the care of a surgeon, and heated it slowly, evenly. The solder flowed into the joint in a perfect silver ring. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was another lesson. Persistence isn't about brute force. It's about refined focus. As the bones of the house took shape, so did my relationship with the town. Hank started stopping by once a week, always with a thermos of coffee and a critical eye. He'd point out a bolt that needed tightening, or suggest a better way to run a wire. His approval was grudging, but it was there. "You're slow," he grunted one day, "but you're not stupid. You've got his hands." That was the highest compliment he could give. Sal, from the hardware store, would save me materials he thought I might need, giving me a discount. "Found this in the back," he'd say, sliding a box of conduit connectors across the counter. "Might as well go to a good home." I was no longer just the weird kid in the woods. I was Arthur Vance's grandson. I was becoming part of the story of the place. One day, a sleek black sedan I didn't recognize pulled up the logging road. A woman in a sharp business suit got out. She looked impossibly clean and out of place against the backdrop of the forest. "Leo Vance?" she asked, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Eleanor Vance, from Sterling Development." I froze. It was a name from another lifetime. "I'm the lawyer who handled the offer for your property," she explained, her eyes taking in the half-finished structure inside the hut. The piles of scrap metal, the general organized chaos of a construction site. Her expression was a carefully neutral mask, but I could see the surprise in her eyes. She had clearly expected to find me long gone or living in a squalid tent. "Our offer still stands," she said, getting straight to the point. "In fact, given the timeline on our project, we're prepared to increase it. $125,000, close in a week." She said the number as if it were a magic word, a spell that could solve all problems. A few months ago, it would have been. Now, it just sounded hollow. I looked from her expensive suit to my own hands, which were covered in grease and a dozen small cuts. I looked at the steel frame of the second floor, solid and real against the sky. "No, thank you," I said. My voice was calm. There was no hesitation. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Mr. Vance, with all due respect, what you're doing here is ambitious, but it's not practical. This is a life-changing amount of money. You could buy a real house, a finished one." "I'm not interested in buying a house," I said, the words coming to me with absolute certainty. "I'm interested in building one." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even a sliver of respect, crossed her face. "The offer is on the table if you change your mind," she said, handing me her card. "But the bypass is happening. The state will eventually claim the land through eminent domain if we can't acquire it. You'll get fair market value, but it will be a fight, and it will be far less than what we're offering." It was a threat, wrapped in the polite language of the law. The system was pushing back. But I wasn't a ward of the state anymore. I was a landowner. I was a builder. "I'll take my chances," I said. She gave a tight nod, got back in her pristine car, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly on the quiet road. The encounter shook me, but it also solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about building a house anymore. It was about defending it. That night, I opened the next letter. It was as if my grandfather had anticipated this very moment. "Leo," it read, "there will come a time when they try to take this from you. They will come with money, and then they will come with threats. They will call this land property, and this house a non-conforming structure. They will use words to try and diminish what you are building. Do not let them. The letter went on to explain the legal status of the hut. It was built before modern zoning laws were enacted in the county, making it grandfathered in. He had filed all the original permits, all perfectly legal. He then explained how to file for a change of use permit, transforming it from a storage structure to a residential dwelling. He had already filled out most of the paperwork. "You are not a squatter, Leo," he wrote. "You are a resident, improving your dwelling. You have rights. Mr. Abe knows them all. Do not be intimidated. The law, when used correctly, is a tool, just like a hammer or a saw. Learn to use it." The next day I went to see Mr. Abe. I laid out the permit papers on his desk. He looked them over, then looked at me. The hint of a smile was back. "Your grandfather was a meticulous man," he said, "and a stubborn one. Sterling Development has been putting pressure on my office. They are not pleased." "Can they stop me?" I asked. "Not easily," Mr. Abe said, steepling his fingers. "As long as you are actively and demonstrably improving the structure according to code, you are in a strong position. It will be a battle of attrition. They are hoping you will run out of money or patience." I thought of the cash left in the footlocker, which I had barely touched. I thought of the stack of letters still waiting for me. "I have plenty of both," I said. The third floor was the final frontier. According to the plans, this would be the master bedroom, a single, large room with a bathroom, nestled right under the apex of the roof. The final letter in the footlocker was the guide for this last stage. But it was different from the others. It was less technical, more personal. "Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, you are nearing the top. You have built a house from the floor up. You have learned my trade. But there is one last thing you must build, and it is the most important. You must build a future." He wrote about the skylight. It was the capstone of the entire project. He had saved for years to buy the glass, a massive, custom-templated piece of triple-paned insulated glass. It was stored in a huge wooden crate at the very back of the hut. A crate I had assumed was just more raw materials. "When you install this skylight," he wrote, "you will be letting the light in. Do not live in the shadows of your past, Leo. Do not let the system that raised you define you. You are not a case file. You are not an orphan. You are a Vance, and a Vance builds." The day I installed the skylight was the hardest and most triumphant day of the entire project. Hank came, unasked, with his 2 grown sons. "A man can't set a sky window that big by himself," was all he said. Together, we rigged the block and tackle one last time. We hoisted the massive pane of glass, a glittering sheet of captured sky, up through the 3 floors of the house I had built. Guiding it into place was a delicate, terrifying ballet. But when it settled into its frame with a soft sigh, and I secured the final bolt, the transformation was instantaneous. Sunlight, pure and unfiltered, poured down the central staircase, cascading through all 3 levels. It illuminated every beam, every joint, every surface. It banished the last of the shadows. The Quonset hut was gone. In its place was a soaring, light-filled atrium. A home. Standing on the 3rd floor, looking down the spiral staircase that now connected a life, I finally understood. My grandfather hadn't just left me a house. He had left me a curriculum. Each phase of construction was a lesson in disguise. The foundation was patience. The framing was structure. The plumbing and wiring were about systems, about flow. And the skylight. The skylight was about hope. It took another 6 months to finish the interior. The drywall, the painting, the flooring. I learned to install cabinets, to tile a bathroom, to finish wood until it shone. Hank's sons would sometimes stop by to help with a heavy lift. Sal would give me advice on paint colors, and Mr. Abe would handle the legal skirmishes with Sterling Development, which eventually faded away as they rerouted their bypass, defeated by a stubborn ghost and his even more stubborn grandson. On the day I turned 20, I stood on the small balcony I had built off the 3rd floor. The house was done. It wasn't a palace. It was a strange, unique, 3-story home tucked inside the shell of a rusty tin can. From the outside, it still looked like a derelict Quonset hut, but inside, it was a miracle of light and wood and steel. It was my life's work, my foundation, my home. I looked out over the 5 acres of land, my land, and I thought about the journey. I had arrived here a boy with nothing but a backpack and a history of being left behind. And in this quiet patch of woods, I had found not just a home, but a grandfather's love, a community's respect, and most importantly, myself. I had become a builder. This story isn't really about a house. It's about what it means to inherit something more valuable than money. It's about the choice to build something real, even when the world is telling you to take the easy way out. It's about finding your foundation. All of us, in our own way, are given a set of tools and a blueprint by the people who came before us. Sometimes it's a clear map, and sometimes it's a dusty box of secrets. The question is, what will you build with it? If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to build your own foundation out of the pieces you were left with, please share your story in the comments below. I read every one. And if you want to be part of a community that believes in second chances and the power of building your own future, hit that subscribe button, because we all have a house to build. We just have to have the courage to start.